All right. How are you doing this evening, Archbishop?
Fair to middle in.
All right. Well, too bad you couldn't be awesome.
Well, fair to middle in is pretty good for me.
But I guess with your job, that's probably about the best you can get.
Yeah, probably.
I'm sure you got enough people calling and complaining. Hey, all right. So it's 6:30. It's time for another chapter of English church history.
Right, yes it is. There's something of a convention in English history that you treat the 18th century as what might be called the long 18th century. That is to say, from 1688 to 1832. Roughly speaking, from the Glorious Revolution to the Great Reform Act. That actually disguises a change in the general nature of the dialogue within English politics and religious life around 1760, 1770, but we'll get to that a little later on. James II acceded to the throne in 1685, and it was an event which had caused a good deal of storm and stress over the preceding 10 years, since it became open knowledge that the Duke of York was a Roman Catholic. And as a result of this, there had been attempts in the House of Commons to introduce an act debarring him from the succession. And this had produced the original two-party system in England, a division between the Whigs, who opposed the accession of James II, and the Tories who supported it. In the midst of all this controversy in 1678, there had been the famous Popish plot, which may have been Popish and certainly wasn't a plot, which led to the execution of a number of Roman Catholics, including Oliver Plunkett, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Armagh. But the whole thing collapsed when it was discovered that Titus Oates, the principal informer, was a fraud. And so after that, in spite of attempts by the Whigs to try and derail James's succession, it moved towards the inevitable. James succeeded his brother and came to the throne, the first British monarch to be a Roman Catholic in 127 years. James started out badly and got worse. The first thing that he did to upset the political elite in England was to issue a declaration of indulgence. And then over the next 3 years, he proceeded by a number of measures to alienate the political class in England. The first thing that he did was remove the prohibition on Roman Catholics holding commissions in the army and the navy. This was followed by the installation of Roman Catholic fellows in the University of Oxford, particularly at Magdalen College, and then he started challenging the terms on which judges were appointed, and you have the whole Quo Guaranto controversy, which leads up to the Second Declaration of Indulgence. Now, this is a significant event in the history of the Church of England. 7 bishops, Archbishop Sancroft and Bishops Ken, White, Turner, Lake, Lloyd of St Asaph and Trelawney, opposed the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended the penalties for nonconformity. And they were charged basically with contempt of court or a mild form of treason and committed to the Tower. The prosecution collapsed and the 7 bishops were released, but it was a sign to the political class in England that James was more than capable of overreaching his limits as a king. And so what this action succeeded in doing was pushing the moderate Tories into the arms of the Whigs to form a coalition which would invite William and Mary over from the Netherlands. Now, William and Mary were first cousins. William was descended from Charles the First's sister, and Mary was James's daughter by his first marriage. And as such, she had a good claim to England, the throne of England, if her father was set aside. The final nail in James's coffin was that Mary of Modena, his second wife, got pregnant. And the prospect of a Catholic heir to the throne of England and Scotland finally pushed the Tories into action, and an invitation was issued in July 1688 to William in The Hague to come over and put things right. William was at that point at liberty to do so. Louis XIV was no longer quite so active in his attempts to extinguish William's opposition to French hegemony in Europe. And so he had this breathing space, which enabled him to assemble an army and a fleet and sail at the end of October for England. He had hoped to go a little earlier in the campaigning season, actually in the campaigning season. October was awfully late to start a war in the 17th century. But the winds had generally been westerly. The wind finally went around to the east on November the 2nd, and the so-called Protestant wind conveyed William's army safely down the channel to land at Torbay on the 5th of November 1688, a rather significant date, as you will remember. As a result of this, William was able to put his army ashore and begin a long, slow march towards London. What was quite clear was that most folks were hesitant to support William, but they were even more hesitant to support James. And he gradually gathered support on his march to London. What helped him was that the trained bands, the militia, for the most part deserted and supported William. James finally decided that the situation was hopeless in mid-December and attempted to flee, dropping the Great Seal of England in the River Thames as he departed. Unfortunately, some fishermen found him and returned him, much to William's chagrin. He would have been far happier if James had been allowed to escape the first time. However, his second attempt was successful, and Parliament subsequently was to declare the throne vacant by virtue of James's flight. Now, this created a problem. You had a king who was absent and a claimant, actually two, who were present. And there were a whole bunch of conflicting loyalties thrown up. The Whigs were, for the most part, absolutely convinced that the best thing that they could do is depose James and place William and Mary on the throne. The Tories favoured a regency. Nobody was too keen on having James back at this point. There was a small rebellion in Scotland in favour of James, and a somewhat larger one subsequently in Ireland. But the net result was that there was a largely peaceful transition from James II to William and Mary, William being jointly offered the crown after he refused to be, as he put it, his vice gentleman usher. And as a result of this, some conflicting loyalties were thrown up amongst the clergy. Many of them had taken what they regarded as a binding oath to James II as king. And as the doctrines of divine right and passive obedience were very much inculcated in high church clergymen at the time, 9 bishops and about 400 clergy refused to swear to William and Mary, and these included William Sancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Ken, Thomas White, Francis Turner, John Lake, Thomas Cartwright, Robert Frampton, William Thomas, and William Lloyd of Norwich, who's not to be confused with the other William Lloyd, who was one of the 7 bishops imprisoned in the Tower. The of the 7 bishops imprisoned in the Tower under James II, 5 became non-jurors. Now, the fate of the Scottish Episcopal Church is also interesting. The Scots had a far greater loyalty to the House of Stuart than the English. After all, the Stuarts had been ruling Scotland since 1380, and they were certainly more reluctant, first of all, to have James convert the country to Roman Catholicism, but also they were more reluctant to let him go. And when the Scottish bishops, represented by Bishop Rose, were invited to London to swear loyalty to James II, William and Mary, the Bishop of Edinburgh equivocated and said, "Sire, I will only swear so far as my conscience doth allow." And as a result of this, the Scottish Church was disestablished and Presbyterianism put in its place. James, quite wisely, decided to launch a counterattack on the Williamite regime through Ireland. And with the support of French troops, he landed in Ireland in 1689 and was fairly successful in capturing most of the island of Ireland by the end of 1690. Only the towns of Enniskillen and Derry and Carrickfergus held out against James. Carrickfergus was close enough to Scotland that it could be easily resupplied by the Williamite regime. Derry was a different issue and was besieged for 100 days in 1690. The success that William had in raising the siege set in train the eventual defeat of James II. The Williamite army marched south and scored 2 major victories over James's mixed force of French and Irish recruits. The first at the Battle of the Boyne on the 11th of July 1689, and the second at the Battle of Aughrim a year minus 10 days later south of Dublin. And to this day, the 12th in modern calculation is something of a gala day in Northern Ireland, where the Orange Order marches to celebrate the victory of William III over James II. James has the rather unfortunate nickname amongst Irish nationalists of Seamus O'Caca, James the Shit, because he deserted his troops at the Battle of the Boyne and fled for Dublin as fast as his horse would carry him. The result of this was, first of all, a huge number of Huguenots came into Ireland. During the crossing of the Battle of the Boyne, General Schomberg, who was in charge of the left wing of the Williamite army, had shouted to his troops, "Behold, my children, your persecutors," pointing to the French regulars on the hillside in front of him. He was neatly bisected by a cannonball about 20 seconds later. Schomberg's troops consisted largely of French Huguenots who had been forced into exile by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This was an event that added further fuel to the fire that got rid of James. And as a result of William's policy in Ireland, large numbers of French Huguenots were invited to settle in Ireland. So there are 2 sources for French surnames in Ireland. One are the Huguenots, who settled in 1690 to 1700, and before them, of course, the Norman French, back from the days of Strongbow. In the English Church, the rationalistic theology of the Great Chew Circle, the group that had gathered around Lord Herbert, Lord Say and Seal, became increasingly important. Simon Patrick, Edward Stillingfleet, John Tillotson, Thomas Tennyson all became increasingly prominent under William III. Now, the best way of describing the theological attitude of these so-called latitudinarians were they were not liberals in the modern sense, but they preferred to emphasize a simple creedal Christianity in which denominational differences were minimized, and they were particularly popular with the Dutch Calvinist William because of their work to try and reconcile the moderate dissenters to the Church of England. And chief amongst these attempts, which took place against the background of the Williamite War, was the attempt to revise the prayer book to make it more comfortable for Presbyterians and moderate Congregationalists. And there were 10 major points of revision in the Liturgy of Comprehension, as it's become referred to in modern times, of 1689. First of all, the word priest is consistently changed to minister. Sunday is consistently changed to Lord's Day. The lessons from the Apocrypha are removed. The surplus is made optional. The Lord's Prayer is always given with the doxology at the end. Psalm substitutes are provided for the non-biblical, for the canticles. Psalm 148 to replace the Te Deum at morning prayer, although the Te Deum was left in place, and Psalm 8 and Psalm 134 to replace the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis as further alternatives to the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis at evening prayer. The collects were revised and lengthened, often by including a scriptural allusion, usually to the Gospel of the day, in the new text. The Beatitudes were included as a substitute for the Decalogue. Parents were allowed to act as sponsors at baptism. The Catechism was expanded. The marriage service had a lot of its more earthy language removed, and the commination was rewritten. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, a lot of this sounds like the 1789 American prayer book, then you're perfectly correct, because many of the ideas that were put forward in 1688, 1689 for revising the English prayer book were to resurface a century later when the Americans came to revise the 1662 in the days immediately following the end of the War of Independence. The revised prayer book was particularly associated with Bishops Patrick, Tillotson and Lloyd, and also with Dean Stillingfleet, who was a major figure in the lower house of Convocation at the time. However, the whole thing was stillborn, because by the time William came to dictate his religious policy, he was more inclined towards toleration of Orthodox Protestant dissenters. The Toleration Act of 1689 covers everybody except Roman Catholics and Unitarians. Providing that they signed on the dotted line that they were not up to anything seditious and informed the bishop of their existence, they were allowed to meet for public worship. The non-jurors exited the Church of England in 1691 and were very largely replaced by latitudinarians such as Tillotson and Tennyson. But this was also an era where societies were very important in the Church of England. It's an era where the religious society was a major organ of spiritual life in the English Church. So, for example, you have, from 1678 onwards, there was a London society, mainly of high church clergymen, who met together for Bible study and for worship. It's also the era that leads to the formation of SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, in 1698, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in 1701, both of which received their charters from William III. Burnet and Sharp were major figures Burnet, of course, was a Scots-born latitudinarian sharp and a Yorkshire-born high churchman. But they were sort of a tag team, and they could often agree on matters of policy. So in the early years of the reign of Queen Anne, who succeeded to William III after the little gentleman in black velvet had done his work, William died of pneumonia after taking a fall from his horse, which had been unseated by sticking its foot down a molehill. Hence the little gentleman in black velvet, and who was a Jacobite toast for a good 100 years, with the result that £16,000 a year became available to augment poor parishes. Queen Anne was very much the Anglican, and she had been brought up in the high church tradition as it existed under Charles II, and she wanted to see the interests of the Church of England secured and promoted. So, for example, not only did she relinquish her entitlement to first fruits and annates to create Queen Anne's bounty, but she also encouraged the government to provide funding for 50 new churches in the London area. And this is where Hawksmoor's London churches come from. Structures such as St George in the East, St Alphager's Greenwich, St George's Bloomsbury, all examples today of Hawksmoor's raw-boned, unconventional Baroque style. But they also reflect the high church theology of the day and the interest in Christian antiquity. So the dimensions of many of Hawksmoor's churches are governed by the dimensions of the Jerusalem temple. And these churches were paid for by a continuation of the coal tax that had been introduced in 1668 to pay for the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire. Now, Christopher Wren had already set the style for English churches. They were to be single-room buildings, generally with the orientation firstly around the three-decker pulpit, but the altar was to be screened off at the east end, providing a second, smaller room for the communion. English churches in this period are generally used as two rooms. The nave for the service of the word, the chancel for the Blessed Sacrament. And Hawksmoor follows the same pattern. Although it has to be said, in the case of Hawksmoor, there's much more of an eclectic feel to Hawksmoor than Wren. It's also a period in which there is considerable controversy about the foundations of the Christian faith. And perhaps the great controversy of the early 1700s is the one between Samuel Arian Clarke and Daniel Waterland, who died as Archdeacon of Middlesex in 1740. As his nickname suggests, Samuel Clarke supported a Trinitarian theology that was not completely orthodox. There's something in his writing that suggests that, like Sir Isaac Newton, he believed in subordinationism, a mild form of Arianism. And this was picked up on by Daniel Waterland, who, in a series of massively learned tracts, gradually, essentially beat Samuel Clarke's arguments into the ground, concreted them over, and jumped up and down on top of them. And Waterland was to be the standard of Anglican dogmatic theology for over a century. Waterland is definitely in the Reformed tradition, but he is someone who also is a high churchman. So he places emphasis on episcopacy. He leans towards election being more a sign of the church than it being individual, and so on and so forth. And he's held up as the standard of orthodoxy until well into the 19th century. Harold Brown references him quite a lot in his introduction to the 39 Articles. The general temper, though, of the church under George I and George II is increasingly lazy and latitudinarian. The last great theological public battle of the period is in 1708 to 1711, where you have the controversy over occasional conformity, whereby dissenters, mainly Presbyterians, received Holy Communion in Church of England parishes in order to qualify for public office. And a gentleman by the name of Henry Sacheverell, and I use the word gentleman loosely, was indicted for preaching the 5th of November sermon in 1709, with basically causing a breach of the peace, because he pointed to occasional conformists as being the serpent within the church's bosom, and sounded the well-worn but still effective cry of church in danger. The Occasional Conformity Act passed under the Tory administration, but after Queen Anne's death in 1714, childless in her mid-40s, she was succeeded by the first of the German Georges. I'm not going to bore you with the genealogy on this one, but they had to pass over 51 descendants of James I before they found one who was 1, Protestant, and 2, reasonably reliable. And so George I becomes king. George Frederick Handel has a slightly embarrassing moment because he'd fled the court at Hanover to work in London and found his old boss as the new King of England. And he wrote rather a generous apology in the form of his water music. Handel was restored to favour. George I consistently favoured the Whigs, who played the card of, let us govern England, you worry about Hanover and we'll keep England under control. You don't want anything to do with those wicked Tories, they want to bring the Stuarts back. There was a short and unsuccessful rising in 1715, which ended in the defeat of the Scots, if I remember correctly, that time at near Blair Athol. And then George had the major limitation of not being able to speak English. He conversed with his ministers in Latin. And as a result of this, power slipped from the monarchy to the administration. So although George could throw a spanner in the works, he wasn't, in the daily, day-to-day administration in the same way that Anne had been. He was also desperately reliant upon the Whigs, increasingly led by Horace Walpole, and the Whigs made sure they appointed reliable Whigs to the bishoprics in order to round out their voting strength in the House of Lords. If I'm going to characterize the period between 1710 and 1760 as anything, I would say it was extremely slothful in terms of how the Church of England was carrying itself. The 50 new churches fizzled out after 12. Most of Walpole's appointments to bishoprics were governed by the interests of the Whig Party, not the Church of England. Though he did make some good appointments, such as John Potter as Bishop of Oxford in 1717. He was later to become Archbishop of Canterbury in 1737, who, unusually for a Whig, was a high churchman. And then in the 1730s, we have the beginning of a great revival in religion in England. And it comes, of all places, from the University of Oxford. A small group of undergraduates and fellows had gathered around John Wesley and George Whitefield to pray, to read the scriptures, and to receive Holy Communion. And this holy club was methodically devout. They visited prisoners, they received the communion every week in an era when 4 times a year was commonest. They said morning and evening prayer daily. They observed the feasts and fasts of the church, and they rather got fingers pointed at them because of it. And they tried various sorts of nicknames, but the one that stuck was Methodists. The first Methodist to be converted was George Whitefield, who was converted in 1734. Whitefield was something of a boy wonder. He was born in Gloucester. He went up to Oxford at the age of 14. He was ordained by special license at the age of 21. In 1734, he had a crisis of faith and was converted, as he put it, to reliance on Jesus only. John Wesley's conversion follows 4 years later, following an unsuccessful stint in Savannah in 1735 to 1737. A year later, Lady Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon, was converted, and she provided an entree into the aristocratic world of the great Whig salons. So it was a normal form of entertainment for Lady Huntingdon to invite you to dinner, ply you with a decent amount of vintage port, and then expect you to listen to a sermon. And this rather guerrilla form of evangelism was reasonably successful with the upper classes, who gradually became less hostile to Methodism, although even as late as the 1780s, it was a great scandal to William Wilberforce's family when he converted to the evangelical form of Anglicanism. And if you look at the 1730s, the 1740s, the 1750s, the 1760s, the 1770s, the only real signs of life in the Church of England come from the so-called Methodists. But they are a divided movement. Whitefield was a Calvinist. Wesley was an Arminian. The two of them worked together quite successfully most of the time, but it's a matter of historical record that the first president of the Methodist Conference was Whitefield, not Wesley, and he resigned it to Wesley because he found the administrative task cramped his style too much. Lady Huntingdon proved to be very influential in that she had the money and the connections to have chapels built in key locations. There was Sparfields in London. There was also, not surprisingly, a chapel in Bath, a chapel in Brighton, basically anywhere where the upper crust and the respectable end, the leisured end of the middle classes could be expected to gather together. Lady Huntingdon put one of her chapels and installed one of her chaplains to preach. In Wales, there was a great revival started by Daniel Rowlands, who was the curate of Llangeitho in Cardiganshire. And he is generally forgotten about because he preached in Welsh. And he is perhaps more than Howell Davis, the great father of Welsh Methodism, because the idiot Bishop of St. David's removed his license to preach in 1763, driving the Calvinistic Methodists out of the Church of England in Wales. The expulsion of evangelical undergraduates from St. Edward's Hall in Oxford in 1768 led to the foundation of the first theological college in Britain, Trevecca, which was established on a small farm in South Wales and was staffed by people of the quality of William Romaine. Thomas Hawes was involved. it had some heavy hitters very definitely committed to it. The Countess of Huntingdon's connection was forced out of the Church of England in 1779 when the Vicar of Clerkenwell decided to go after, was it Clerkenwell? Yeah, Clerkenwell, decided to go after Lady Huntingdon for using a public meeting space called the Colosseum as a chapel. She'd leased it for 20 years as a place for popular preaching. But the Countess of Huntingdon stuck to her guns. She still required those who had ministered Holy Communion to have been ordained by the Church of England. She required the use of the 1662 prayer book, and to be quite blunt about it, she tolerated no significant deviation from the stated position of the Church of England. Now, the Methodists produced an awful lot of division during these years. First of all, the cautious were inclined to dismiss them as religious fanatics. And after the 17th century, with its overdose of religious enthusiasm, enthusiasm in the 18th century is a word that is somewhat akin to being possessed in modern language, and had its basin full of religious enthusiasm in the previous century, so they looked upon the Methodists with extreme favour. Wesley was determined not to be driven out of the Church of England. He was also determined not to give up his work as an itinerant evangelist. Wesley probably wore out more horseshoes than any other single individual in the 18th century. He was perpetually on the move, from Bristol to London to Newcastle to Ireland to the Isle of Man to Scotland. On one occasion to America. He was always on the move, always preaching. But the societies that he founded were not supposed to challenge the established church. They were modeled on the religious societies of the late 17th century. There was a specific undertaking in the early days of Methodism not to hold Methodist meetings at the same time as divine worship in the parish church. Methodists were expected to receive the sacrament in the Church of England. In fact, Methodist ministers were not ordained in England until, strictly speaking, weren't allowed to administer communion until the 1780s, very close to the end of Wesley's life, and it produced a rift between John and Charles Wesley, who John was heavily criticised by his brother for ordaining, in inverted commas as his brother would have it, Methodist preachers, and he particularly copped it for Coke and Asbury. His brother basically asked the question, and John laid hands on Coke and Asbury, but who laid hands on him? Indicating that his brother did not have the power to consecrate superintendents, or as they promptly called themselves when they got back to North America, bishops. In the Church of England, the progress of Methodism revolves around people such as William Romaine, Henry Venn, John Beveridge, who were the early Methodist clergy. They were also parish clergy. And although they might occasionally pop over the border into neighbouring parishes to do a bit of field preaching on weekdays, they were very loyal to their home parishes. In 1774, their number was augmented by a certain John Newton, a converted slave ship captain who had come to realise the error of his ways and had been converted by what he was later to describe as amazing grace. Also influential during this period was Augustus Toplady, the writer of Rock of Ages, who was a lecturer in one of the parish churches in London. So vital religion in the 1760s and the 1770s was very much a concern of the Methodists, both inside and outside of the church. The great controversy within Methodism was over predestination. And the later division between Wesleyan Methodism, which very largely left the Church of England, and what was increasingly referred to as evangelicalism, which stayed within the Church of England, was mainly to do with Arminianism. The Arminians generally left and became Wesleyan Methodists. The Calvinists generally stayed and became the evangelical party within the Church of England. And as a result of this, the relationship between Methodism and the evangelicals in the Church of England was not initially particularly warm. What about the High Church movement in this period? Well, it kind of went to sleep. Under George I and George II, the surest way to remain an obscure ecclesiastic was to be a high churchman. Very few high churchmen were preferred during this period, although Edmund Gibson became Bishop of London. Potter, of course, was Archbishop of Canterbury. George Herring, who had some high church tendencies, eventually became Archbishop of Canterbury in succession to Potter. But the vast majority of the bishops under George I and George II were latitudinarian and Whig in their outlook. And it's perhaps characteristic of them that Archbishop Herring is on record as describing his age as being one that enjoyed the benign and comfortable air of liberty and toleration. It was the temper of the age. Religious excitement was to be suppressed. The liturgy was to be recited, morality was to be upheld, and the great cardinal truths of Scripture were to be preached. But of enthusiasm, they wanted nothing. All this was to change with the accession of George III in 1760. George often gets a very bad rap in America for something that was very largely beyond his control, which is the departure of the American colonies from the British Empire. But George himself is probably one of the easiest English kings to live with. His nickname in the period was Farmer George. He was interested in agricultural improvement. He uncertainly defended what was left of the royal prerogative. And unlike his grandfather and his great-grandfather, he was definitely an Anglican. His grandfather and his great-grandfather had both been rather liberal Lutherans. And George III aligned himself with Toryism and with high churchmanship. So there is a gradual shift away from the appointment of low church Whigs after 1760 towards the appointment of high churchmen. Being Tory was less essential. And so the major driving force behind this was the fact that George tended to find high churchmen more serious about their religion. The suspicion of infidelity always hung around the latitudinarian clergy. George patronized high churchmen such as George Horne, later on Charles Manners Sutton, John Moore, William Markham, all of whom represented a sort of moderate high churchman, and they were men who were essentially men of business. They got the job done. Some of them, such as Bealby Porteous, were sympathetic to Methodism. Others were appointed on the basis of a strong academic record, such as Bishop Louth, the great grammarian, who was appointed Bishop of London in the 1760s. And all of this produced a gradual shift away from the latitudinarianism of the early 18th century towards the situation that was to bring to birth the beginnings of a church revival at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Evangelicals introduced fervent preaching into the parishes. High churchmen worked on restoring the creaking machinery of the Church of England to something approaching a state of efficiency. Certainly from 1780 onwards, there's some very real reforms which we will address in next week's lecture. Okay, that's my 45 minutes. Any questions? Everybody's sort of sitting there looking nervous. Anybody want to leap in?
Well, you did a good job. I mean, didn't leave us anything to question about. I mean, you covered a lot. I mean, I'm just trying to, think of some good questions to ask. I mean, I could always lead down a little bit more, because Whitefield was an astonishing character. I mean, there's stories of where he came over in a two-boat convoy, and by the time he came here, he converted both ships, and they were tying up on Sundays and having full service. And the English Marines were his choir, and everybody was converted on the ships. You got Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin didn't believe that he could preach to a crowd. I forget the crowd amount, like 40,000 or something. And he ended up being at the end of the crowd and could hear, Whitefield perfectly clear. And, in Wesley, there's a lot of stories. I mean, but I don't think Wesley, it seems like Methodism had a following, but it didn't seem like Wesley was as prominent as Whitefield was in America, especially drawing the crowds.
Yeah. Wesley tended to concentrate on the United Kingdom. His appearances in America were relatively infrequent, whereas Whitefield, of course, did 3 tours, and he died in Newburyport. And as a result of this, the father of American Methodism is very much Whitefield. But a lot of those who were directly associated with the early days of Methodism in America conformed to the Protestant Episcopal Church in the 1780s and the 1790s because they didn't like the Coke-Asbury approach. You got a little bit of the same theological division that you got in England carrying on over here. So the foundations of the evangelical movement in the Episcopal Church are laid by people like Isaac Milner, who was in Philadelphia and then New York, who had originally been ordained as Methodist preachers, but later received Episcopal ordination, funnily enough in Milner's case, from Samuel Seabury. And as a result of this, you get the beginnings of an evangelical movement in the Episcopal Church, which was to be dominant in the 19th century up until the war between the states. Wesley, on the other hand, was much more devoted to the English scene, and the Methodist associations in England became the foundation of the later Methodist Church. There wasn't an awful lot going on in the real founders in America are Coke and Asbury. Whitefield prepared the ground. Wesley ordained Coke and Asbury. But before about 1780, Methodism is pretty small in America, and then it just sort of takes off exponentially. It passes the Episcopal Church in terms of numbers within about 20 years because it is so well adapted to the frontier environment. It also does well in areas like South Carolina, North Carolina, certain parts of Virginia, where the Episcopal Church has a period of decline before it gets its house in order shortly after 1800.
Follow-up question with you made me think of this from, I'm a little unclear on this. Whitfield, I guess it was later in his life, that he couldn't, he wasn't allowed or couldn't get a to preach in England. I mean, he would preach to crowds, but to go into a church, he was basically barred, or is there some, I've read several things on him. You always get to that part, it's a little confusing, and I haven't read anything.
It is a little confusing. What tended to happen was that incumbents would not allow him to preach in the parish church because the rector or vicar of the parish had absolute control of the pulpit. So Whitfield ended up preaching elsewhere. He was also one of the Countess of Huntingdon's chaplains. So his primary connections in England were with the Countess of Huntingdon's connection and the somewhat loose coalition of chapels that she'd put together in the major centres. I mean, Whitfield, whenever he was in London, preached at Spa Fields. So his major commitments in terms of preaching increasingly were outside of the parochial system, but not outside of the Church of England. We have that rather weird institution in England called a proprietary chapel, which is controlled by a group of trustees. And although the clergyman is licensed by the bishop, he's not really under the control of the bishop in the same way that a rector or vicar would be. And they were a very fashionable and a very easy way of creating additional church accommodation in the 18th century when you needed an act of parliament to create a new parish. And the government was always way too busy for church business. So it was much easier just to get a group of trustees together, put the money together for a chapel, sell off the pews to pay down the debt, and appoint a minister of your own choosing. And London was fairly lousy with them in the late 18th century. Places like Bedford Chapel, Spa Fields, the Colosseum also became a proprietary chapel. The Margaret Street Chapel, you know, there was a large number of these proprietary chapels pretty much in every large town in England. Bath had several of them because there were the two parish churches, but they were overcrowded. So, you know, they put the money together in Bath to build a chapel and engage a fashionable preacher. Jane Austen attended one of the proprietary chapels in Bath whenever she was there, which may explain her slightly ambiguous attitude to the evangelical movement. Given her father was a high churchman, but she often listened to evangelical preachers.
All right, I'll let somebody else ask another question.
I wanted to kind of follow up on what you, Father Patrick and Bishop were talking about. When I was younger, and you know, over here in the States, it seemed the emphasis or the kind of the contrast I made between Whitefield or Whitfield and Wesley was Whitfield was more along the Calvinistic line and Wesley wasn't. I was wondering if that was your understanding, Archbishop.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there was a merry controversy between the followers of Whitfield and the followers of Wesley on just that point. Rock of Ages was Topladi's poetic response to some of the more extravagant Arminian statements that were made by Charles Wesley. And there was quite a pamphlet war in the 1740s between 1740s and 1750s between those on the Calvinistic side of evangelicalism and those on the Arminian side. And in England, it's really, that's the dividing line in the 18th century between those who stayed in the Church of England and those who drifted into what was eventually to become the Methodist Church.
And then as a follow-up to that, is that I grew up in the state of Pennsylvania, and it seems like Methodism was very successful there too. You go out into the country in Pennsylvania today, every little town has got a Methodist church. It really spread widely in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Whitfield was extremely successful in Philadelphia. And, you know, as was the tendency of the times, the ideas went, you know, out from the big city into the back country. And Methodism generally is extremely strong along the frontier line. So what is now central Pennsylvania was like like the Shenandoah Valley, like central North Carolina, upcountry in South Carolina. It was one of those areas that had a very strong Methodist influence at the time in which it was first being successfully settled by those of English and Scots and Ulster origins. Although the Ulstermen tended to remain faithful to Presbyterianism.
True, there was a lot of Presbyterianism in Western Pennsylvania also.
Wilberforce, who was the parliamentarian that led the charge against slavery, who was the guy that was in Parliament that led for freeing the slaves?
Oh, I don't remember that offhand.
Yeah, I read his book. I read the whole challenge and he was, and I can't remember. I was going to ask because I can't remember what it said. If he was, I think he was a Methodist or fallen into that camp, and there was a whole religious movement to free the slave, not to have slavery in England anymore.
Mm-hmm. There was no slavery in England.
I was going to follow up with that question on. I couldn't remember all of it, but was that part of that movement that led?
Right. Now then, you have legally, slavery did not exist in England because when Lord Mansfield was asked to rule on whether slaves could be kept in England, he eventually gave his judgment against it. And his reasoning being that there was no provision in the law for slavery. So, whenever a slave was landed on English soil, he or she automatically became free. However, the colonial legislatures had made provision for slavery. So, under colonial law, for example, in Barbados or Virginia, slavery was legal. Now, the first great point of attack when it came to slavery was the slave trade, which is the focus of Wilberforce's campaign from the early 1780s through to the abolition of the trade in 1809. And it is one of the great evangelical campaigns of the 18th, early 19th centuries. And the key figures in it are folks with evangelical connections. You've got Beelby Porteous, the Bishop of London, who's the first senior English ecclesiastic to come out in favour of abolition. You have John Newton, whose testimony on the nature of the slave trade, firsthand, of course, was decisive in influencing Parliament against the continuation of the trade. William Pitt the Younger told Wilberforce he would do nothing, in spite of being the Prime Minister and under considerable pressure to shut Wilberforce down. He would do nothing to interfere with Wilberforce's desire to abolish the trade. Hannah More, the evangelical authoress, wrote a good deal against the slave trade. So you've got the evangelicals working to bring about the abolition of the trade. The fly in the ointment, in English legal terms, that delayed the final abolition of slavery in the British Empire until 1833 was how to reimburse vested interests. And if you look at the 1833 Act, which makes provision for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, most of its provisions concern the compensation of slaveholders for the loss of their property, and furthermore lay out a path from slavery to freedom for those enslaved in the British colonies. There was no sudden emancipation in the British colonies. It was more of a graduated thing, so that you didn't suddenly have a vast number of landless people wandering around in search of a job. And it's rather characteristic of the way in which the evangelicals worked that they did make proper provision both for the resettlement of the emancipated slaves and the compensation of the former owners. To what degree that was successfully carried out is arguable, but it's typical of the rather humanitarian nature of evangelical legislation in Parliament in the early 19th century.
All right. Anybody got any more questions? Father Paul was the one that came up with the answer. It was Thomas Clarkson.
That's
who I was thinking about, that led that. It like took him 20 years or 15 years of constant battle in Parliament, fights after fights.
25 years.
Yeah, and I mean it was a long time ago when I read the book, so you only remember the good parts and pieces of it. But yeah, he definitely, and I couldn't remember what it said in the book, if he was a Methodist. It came across, if I remember correctly, that he was definitely a very strong evangelical.
Yes, he was.
And I can't remember what he was in specifics, but
the reason Wilberforce was so important, that he had the connections with the mercantile community in London. Because living out in Clapham, he knew people like the Thorntons, who were associated with the East India Company. So he had the connections to build a workable parliamentary alliance to bring about abolition, which is why Clarkson fastened on to Wilberforce once Wilberforce showed an interest. The difficulty for Wilberforce, I think more than anything else, was that one of the things you have to remember about Wilberforce is he had extremely poor health. And he was fighting this campaign a lot of the time in Parliament with very limited support. And I think it was Lord Macaulay who described the abolition of the slave trade in 1809 as one of the extremely rare, one of the very few totally altruistic acts committed by the English Parliament. And it's difficult to underestimate the force of character required from Clarkson and Wilberforce to push the thing through. I mean, it came so close, so often, from 1792 onwards, that it was the frustration of knowing, they were in 15, 20, 25, 30 votes of getting a majority. If 15 people had voted the other way, it would have gone through. But the great joy for them was when it did finally pass, it passed by a huge majority. It was like with the Napoleonic War, with Britain finally pushing forward in the Napoleonic Wars, the increasing acceptance of the evangelical view of morality. The moment was right in 1809 for Parliament to take decisive action.
All right. Any more questions for the Archbishop? All right. Well, hey, Archbishop, thank you.
There was one thing popped up on the bottom of my screen. The basic trouble with Waterland is the only form in which Waterland is available these days is in the 7-volume set that was edited by William Van Milbert and published between 1813 and 1821. I believe it's one of those things that is, on the internet, and, go and look it up. I'll have a dig round and find out, how it's divided up. But certainly Waterland is a very useful writer on baptism and also on the Eucharist. I think Harold Brown quotes him on the baptism. But I'll have a route round and I'll pass the information along about Waterland.
All right, another great class. Hey, could you close us all out in prayer?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
O gracious Father, we humbly beseech thee for thy holy Catholic Church, that thou wouldest be pleased to fill it with all truth in all peace. Where it is corrupt, purify it. Where it is in error, direct it. Where in anything it is amiss, reform it. Where it is right, establish it. Where it is in want, provide for it. Where it is divided, reunite it. For the sake of him who died and rose again, and ever liveth to make intercession for us, Jesus Christ, thy Son, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, all.